Jasper could still feel the crisp Montana breeze on his cheeks, even though he was a boy of just 9, the first time it happened. He remembered the way the tall evergreens towered overhead, their needle-laden branches rocking in unison as gusts of wind pulled through Glacier National Park's mountainous landscape. The sunlight moved in quiet beams across the forest floor, lighting spots of moss and scattering itself over the ground like gold coins. The entire afternoon smelled of wet bark, pine sap, and a hint of wildness that he could never put into words. In that single moment, his father's strong hand clasped around his boots crunching down on pine needles, Jasper learned the meaning of awe and humility. That was also the day he learned that heartbeats can skip in the face of wonder and fear. Halfway along a narrow trail near Lake McDonald, Jasper looked up to see a young bear standing at a distance, its hulking silhouette rust, brown fur catching the last rays of afternoon sunlight, signaled the distinct shape of a grizzly cub. Despite all the cautions about staying away from wildlife, despite all the times his father had reminded him to keep calm in any encounter, Jasper found himself drawn to the creature's dark eyes. But it wasn't just him who stared in reverence. The bear seemed curious, too. Its gaze flickered from Jasper's small figure to his father. For a long moment that felt like hours, human and bear simply observed one another in the hush of the wilderness. Then the bear ambled forward, small enough for a grizzly, but still large enough to fill Jasper with an electric blend of terror and excitement. Jasper's father stepped in front of him and slowly raised an arm, speaking softly to keep the bear at a distance. At that crucial instant, Jasper understood something that would remain with him for the rest of his life. That nature had a heartbeat all its own, powerful and tender at once. The cub studied them intently, its ears twitching, until a sound from deeper in the woods, perhaps its mother, snapped it to attention. It lumbered away with a slow gait, glancing back only once at Jasper before disappearing. Jasper felt a pang of longing and regret, as though he'd missed a chance to bond with something ancient and mighty. His father sighed in relief, placed a steady hand on Jasper's shoulder, and resumed the hike. But Jasper, only half listening to the lecture about safety around wildlife, couldn't get that bear's eyes out of his mind. Glacier National Park was practically Jasper's backyard. His father, an enthusiastic nature guide, believed the best education happened outdoors. So when Jasper wasn't in school, he accompanied his father along the winding trails, up the slopes lined with wildflowers, and across the pristine waters of Lake McDonald. Jasper learned how to track animal footprints, identify edible plants, and navigate by the sun. Every lesson was a chance to bond with his father, but also a chance to scan the undergrowth for that same bear. He returned to the spot multiple times over the next few years, always imagining he might see the russet-furred cub who had once stared at him with such intensity. Occasionally, he'd find a fresh paw print or some scuffling in the dirt. Once, he even spotted what might have been the same bear in the far distance. But it never came as close as it had that first day. And eventually, the glimpses stopped. Jasper and his father told themselves that the bear must have grown, ventured into less traveled areas of the park, and like many wild creatures, simply stayed away from humans. In high school, Jasper's obsession gradually dulled from a blazing fire to a comforting ember. Sure, he still felt a pang whenever he saw pictures of grizzlies in nature magazines, and he sometimes found his mind wandering to that moment of strange connection. But time was an expert at tucking away old wonders beneath the daily tasks of adolescence. He had crushes, sports, and part-time jobs to distract him. Shortly after Jasper turned 18, his father passed away in a sudden accident, a car crash on a slick road. The loss uprooted him. Grief pressed down like a weight on his chest. The forest no longer looked the same without his father's presence. For a year, Jasper shut himself off from the world, rarely speaking of anything other than the practical details of his life. Nature, once his great refuge, became a silent reminder of the father he'd lost. It wasn't until years later, in his early 20s, that Jasper decided to return to Glacier National Park. A friend suggested a short trip to his old stomping grounds. At first, he hesitated. The grief was still raw, and the idea of visiting places so closely tied to his father's memory threatened to unravel him. Yet, a voice inside coaxed him to go. When he arrived at Lake McDonald, the sight of those shimmering waters pinned beneath soaring mountains made his throat tighten. He could almost see himself as a 9-year-old boy standing at the shoreline, the summer sun on his back. This time, instead of dread, he felt a comforting presence. It was as though his father's spirit had returned in the hush of the pines and the calls of distant birds. Jasper found himself taking in deep breaths of the fresh air, stepping along the shore, letting the pebbles crunch beneath his boots. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of tears that held not only sorrow, but also gratitude for having known such a vibrant father. For the chance to reclaim these cherished memories, he spent 3 days at the park, wandering old trails, journaling, and sitting quietly by the water's edge. Each night, as the sky turned a milky violet with stars shimmering overhead, he remembered being a kid, enthralled by the cosmos, pointing out constellations with his father. By the end of the trip, something in him had shifted. He felt stronger, as though the wilderness had whispered that it was all right to move on, to carry memories without letting them become shackles. Encouraged by that sense of renewal, Jasper went back to everyday life. Over time, he relocated to Seattle for university, focusing on environmental science, a subject that felt like the perfect extension of the love for nature his father had instilled. He excelled in his studies, made new friends, and eventually met the woman who would become his fiancée, Celia. From the moment he saw her in a campus library, poring over textbooks with frayed edges, Jasper knew she was special. Celia had a lively sense of curiosity, a luminous warmth about her that reminded him of the rustling sunlight in Glacier's forests. She was the kind of person who noticed beauty in small details: a crooked leaf, the swirl of coffee foam, the chipped paint of an old park bench. It wasn't long before they were inseparable. They finished their degrees together, traveling to different national parks whenever they could: Crater Lake in Oregon, Yosemite in California, Yellowstone in Wyoming, until, eventually, Celia found a job as a park ranger, echoing the same vocation Jasper's father had once loved. Jasper himself dove into freelance nature photography, capturing the raw essence of landscapes, wildlife, and human stories in remote corners of the world. But no matter where he roamed, a piece of his heart always remained tethered to that memory of a bear watching him, forging some unspoken kinship that had become part of his identity. When Jasper decided to propose to Celia, there was no doubt in his mind where it should happen: back in Glacier National Park. Her eyes sparkled when she realized where they were headed. They arrived on a bright August day, the sun painting everything in soft gold. As they drove the famed Going to the Sun Road, climbing over the Continental Divide, with awe-inspiring views. Each turn revealed new vistas, glaciers etched into distant peaks, waterfalls plunging off sheer rock faces, meadows vibrant with lupine and bear grass. That evening, he took her for a walk along Lake McDonald's shore. The wind whispered through the trees as the sun set in brilliant strokes of orange, pink, and violet. Jasper led her to the spot where he had once encountered the bear as a boy. Though the park's terrain shifted over the years, he remembered the area as though it were etched in his memory. He knelt on the pebbly beach, the lake's gentle waves lapping at the shore behind him, and revealed a simple ring that glistened with a small diamond. He'd chosen the ring because it reminded him of a drop of water, an echo of nature's purity. His heart thundered in his chest as he asked her to share her life with him. Tears brimmed in Celia's eyes, and she nodded so fiercely that her hair fell across her face. He slipped the ring on her finger, and they embraced. Beneath a blazing tapestry of sunset, Jasper knew his life had just changed forever. They chose to host the wedding in the same place, Glacier National Park. At first, friends and family questioned the practicality: lodging, travel, the unpredictability of the weather in the mountains. But to Jasper and Celia, no other location could possibly hold as much meaning. Over the ensuing months, they planned a modest gathering. Invitations went out to about 50 guests, each printed with a watercolor painting Celia had made of Lake McDonald's shoreline. Jasper handled the photography logistics, ensuring there would be multiple cameras to capture the day. Celia coordinated with the park authorities, sorting out the necessary permits and making sure they'd be allowed to hold a small ceremony on the lakeshore. As the wedding date approached, everything seemed to click. The park rangers were cooperative, thrilled that two nature enthusiasts were tying the knot in a place they loved. Jasper's mother wept tears of joy upon seeing her son so happy. Celia's parents flew in, marveling at the grandeur of the park. Even the forecast looked promising, a mild, sunny day with a gentle breeze. And yet, as Jasper busied himself with the details, double-checking the chairs set up on the bank, testing the microphones that would carry their vows over the water, his mind drifted, unexpectedly, to that bear. It had been so many years since he'd caught even a shadow of it. With a pang, he wondered if it was still alive, roaming the remote corners of Montana's wilderness. Part of him hoped the bear was out there, healthy and free, though he never imagined he might see it again. The morning sun rose over the mountains in a burst of light that shimmered across Lake McDonald. Warmth touched the pine forests and the bright green grass where the guests would soon gather. Jasper stood at the water's edge, inhaling the crisp air. Dressed in a simple suit, he could sense the day's importance pulsing in his chest, like the drumming of a grouse hidden among the pines, or the rush of rapids in a nearby stream. As Celia emerged from the rustic cabin a short walk away, Jasper's breath caught in his throat. Her dress was ivory, flowing softly around her like morning mist. A wreath of wildflowers crowned her hair, delicate petals swaying in the gentle wind. She was radiant against the backdrop of ancient spruce trees and the glimmering lake. Guests found their places in a small semicircle of chairs. The officiant, a longtime friend who understood their passion for nature, stood under a simple wooden arch, adorned with sprigs of cedar and wild blossoms. Celia walked toward Jasper, each step echoing across the silent reverence of the assembled loved ones. Birds sang faintly in the background, as though nature itself blessed the union. When at last she reached him, they joined hands. The ceremony began with a tribute to the park, to the forces that had shaped both of their lives. Then Jasper and Celia recounted the story of how they met, how they shared an unbreakable bond with the wilderness, how they found solace and meaning in the grand sweep of nature. By the time they exchanged vows, tears glistened in more than a few eyes. Their promises were simple, yet profound devotions to respect one another, to honor life's unpredictability, and to keep discovering the world's mysteries. Side by side, they exchanged rings, just as a breeze rustled the nearby pines, and somewhere a loon called out in the distance, its haunting cry echoing across the lake. The timing felt magical, as though the forest itself was offering an applause of wind through branches and birdsong on the breeze. A moment later, the officiant declared them married. Their guests erupted in cheers and laughter, hugging one another as Jasper drew Celia close for their first kiss as husband and wife. Hardly had the applause subsided when a hush fell over the crowd. It began at the outer edges, people craning their necks, eyes widening, hands clutched to mouths. Confusion rippled inward until someone near the front gasped and whispered, "Bear." Jasper and Celia turned slowly, hearts pounding, to see what everyone was staring at. Emerging from the shadowy tree line was a grizzly, its coat shimmering brown with silver tips. A majestic and powerful creature, it ambled forward, stopping a safe distance from the ceremony. Its broad head shifted from side to side, as if surveying the odd assembly of humans by the water's edge. For an instant, nobody moved. Instinct told them to keep calm, to not startle the bear with sudden movements or loud noises. Yet the atmosphere was not one of terror so much as astonishment. The bear's posture wasn't threatening. Instead, it looked almost curious. In Jasper's heart, an inexplicable certainty took hold. Without a doubt, he recognized something in its stance, in the way the bear regarded him with dark, intelligent eyes. This was not a random visitor. Though fully grown now, and clad in the powerful muscles of an adult grizzly, Jasper sensed an unbroken thread back to his childhood. It was the same bear. He felt his pulse quicken, memories surging, that young cub in the dappled sunlight, the protective press of his father's hand, those round, inquisitive eyes. And now here the creature stood, as if to say, "I remember you too." A tremor ran through Jasper's hands as Celia squeezed them gently. He looked at her, saw the awe in her face, and knew she understood. This was more than a random wildlife sighting. This was a convergence of life's most meaningful undercurrents. The guests watched in silence, some fearful, others transfixed by the majesty of the creature. A park ranger among them placed a hand on his bear spray, prepared, but also reluctant to escalate the situation. Rangers are trained to keep people and wildlife safe, but this moment felt sacred. With measured confidence, Jasper took a single step toward the bear. He tried to keep his posture calm, recalling every piece of training his father had ever given him. Never run, never scream, appear non-threatening yet firm. The bear huffed softly, shifting its weight. Celia came up alongside Jasper, her hand looped around his arm. They stood together, a bride and groom facing the wild. Jasper's voice came out in a low whisper. "It's all right." He wasn't sure if he was comforting the guests, Celia, or even the bear itself. For a second that stretched into eternity, the bear peered at them, nose twitching, perhaps smelling the perfume of flowers, the swirl of human scents, the lingering smoke from morning campfires. Then, as though acknowledging some invisible bond, it gave another huff, turned, and lumbered back into the shadows of the trees. A wave of relieved laughter and chatter spread through the guests, like a wind ruffling through tall grass. Everyone wore wide eyes and shaky smiles. The tension melted into exhilaration. There was no doubt this would be a wedding story for the ages. The reception, held in a nearby wooden pavilion, vibrated with conversation about the extraordinary moment. Speeches were given between bites of hearty barbecue and fresh salad, each guest referencing the bear with either wonder or a hint of comedic nervousness. Someone half-joked that the bear was there to give Jasper his father's blessing. Others remarked on the cosmic alignment of a bear, showing up at the exact moment two nature lovers tied the knot. When Jasper's mother stood to speak, her voice trembled with emotion. She recalled how Jasper's father had taught them both to love the wilderness, to see in its grand spectacle a reminder of humility and courage. She wiped a tear from her cheek and said, "I can't help but think that was your father's way of letting you know. He's here with you, Jasper. He loved these mountains, and maybe, just maybe, he's showing us that the love between a father and son, between two souls who treasure nature, is never truly lost." Jasper closed his eyes to steady himself. He pictured his father's face, smiling under that wide-brimmed ranger hat, telling him, "You have to respect the bear, Jasper. If you do, maybe one day it'll respect you back." That night, with stars stretching across the sky and a swirling band of the Milky Way, Jasper and Celia slipped away from the reception and made their way back to the lakeshore. The moonlit water shimmered. Jasper took off his shoes, letting his feet sink into the cool pebbles. Celia joined him, lifting the hem of her dress as they strolled. In the stillness, they didn't speak for a long while. The nightbirds called in the distance, and somewhere above, an owl hooted, scanning the moonlit terrain for prey. Jasper thought about how his life had turned out, how he had lost a father, but gained an unshakable love of the natural world, and now a partner who shared that devotion. Finally, Celia turned to him, her eyes glowing in the moonlight. "I want you to know," she said softly, "that I feel it too, the connection, the purpose that brought us here. I don't know if that's the same bear from your childhood, but I believe in what it represents. Life isn't random. We keep meeting the people and the experiences we need. In one way or another, Jasper felt tears welling in his eyes. He recalled the swirl of conflicting emotions that had once kept him from returning to Glacier National Park, the anguish of losing his father, and he realized how each of those events had shaped him for this moment. He threaded his fingers through Celia's and whispered, "I think part of me has been waiting all my life to see that bear again, waiting for this sense of wholeness." They stood quietly, letting the night enfold them in a tapestry of shadow and silver light. They were not alone. The forest pulsed with unseen life, and the lake lapped at the shore, timeless and patient. In the weeks and months following the wedding, pictures of the ceremony circulated among friends and relatives. The one that captivated everyone the most was taken by a quick-thinking guest who snapped a shot at the exact moment the bear emerged from the woods. You could see Jasper and Celia in the foreground, hands intertwined, their posture as if transfixed by the vision of nature itself. The bear, half in shadow and half in sunlight, stood like a silent sentinel. The story became something of a local legend. Park rangers joked about how that couple in Glacier had a bear as their wedding crasher. But for Jasper and Celia, it was far more than a novelty. It was a symbol of how life's threads can weave together in extraordinary ways. They spent their honeymoon exploring other corners of the park, hiking remote trails in many glacier, canoeing across Swift Current Lake, and marveling at the glaciers that still clung to the mountaintops. Each day felt like an affirmation of their vows to seek out the wonder in the natural world and in each other, no matter what hardships or surprises came their way. They brought up the idea of possibly moving closer to Glacier. After all, Celia's job as a park ranger was flexible, and Jasper could do his freelance photography from anywhere. They joked that if the bear decided to pay another visit, they wanted to be around for it. Deep down, though, they knew that might have been their last direct encounter with that particular grizzly. Bears roam huge territories, and it might wander even deeper into wilderness areas. That was okay. The bear had already given them a gift beyond measure. It had shown up at the very moment they formalized their bond, bridging the threads of Jasper's childhood with the promise of his future. In the following years, Jasper and Celia returned to Glacier whenever they could. Sometimes they'd see evidence of bears' tracks, scat, or claw marks on trees. Each time, they'd exchange a quiet smile, reminded of the visitor on their wedding day. They also worked tirelessly to raise awareness for wildlife conservation, using Jasper's photography and Celia's ranger platform to educate communities. Time and again, they shared their story, how a connection forged in childhood had come full circle on the most significant day of Jasper's life, how nature and love could dovetail in ways no one could predict. Some people called it a miracle, others dismissed it as chance, but to Jasper and Celia, it was simply testament to the truth they carried in their hearts, that life is woven together in an endless tapestry, each thread crossing paths with others in the most beautiful and unexpected designs. On each anniversary, they returned to that same lakeshore, hand in hand. A hush would fall between them as they remembered the vow they'd made to one another and the silent witness who had emerged from the forest. They'd speak softly to the wind, expressing gratitude for the journey that had led them here, for the father who had taught Jasper to cherish nature's power, and for the bear who had reminded them that sometimes what we think is gone forever might just reappear, offering hope, connection, and the promise that each moment is alive with possibility. And so they carried on, resilient in their bond, connected in spirit to the wilderness that had shaped them, and guided by the personal growth they'd undergone in the shadow of mighty mountains and deep forests. Ever after, whenever they closed their eyes, they would see not only the silhouette of a bear framed by dancing sunlight, but also the shining truth that we are never entirely alone, and that the world, if we listen closely, always has more to show us.